effect that chocolate likes to go to your hips. And I said, I'm like chocolate. All right, now this is the sound where you think the sound should be. I'll keep on talking and we can get that part straight. Oh, we want to go on number one because people are trying to...
I know.
Okay.
I know. I just want to see how it came back here.
Okay.
So don't go fretting a whole lot yet.
I can maybe fix something else up with a light yet to get a really bright light on it.
I can move, and you can maybe move it closer.
No, that's not doing anything.
What, the light?
Yeah.
Want to bet?
Oh, no, light is doing plenty. But I'm saying that where Lou is sitting isn't harming anything. Of course, next time nobody can sit where you are because I'm going to go back and forth with astrology charts and things like that.
You have to be a pretty tall person to get in the way, though.
Yeah, I suppose.
Are we in for another 100-minute?
No. You know what that was last time? It was an hour and 45 minutes long. And I'm going to have to redo that thing in summer because it came out so bad. And there was a lot of astrology information in there that was important that, you know.
Are we transmitting online?
We are transmitting online, yes. Is it showing up? Is the green the green line is it's transmitting, and we're just about all right. Let's start the capture. We can start.
Okay.
Is your swallow going?
Oh yeah, thank you. I am not made for this technical world at all. All right, I'm set, Jerry. Let's go.
Yeah, we're capturing.
Okay. All right, this is a resumption of a series of talks on modern mysticism. And since it's a resumption, that means a tiny review is necessary so we can reorient ourselves and so that new people can figure out where we are. Modern mysticism, as we're looking at it, issues from primarily Western mystery schools. And we began with a few talks on first principles, and then we did many talks on cosmography. Cosmography is the study by the spiritual study of the layout of the spiritual worlds. After many talks on that, we have gone to a sub-series on cosmology. And cosmology is about how things are done in the spiritual worlds. And the primary tool of cosmology is the cycle. Cycles do progress, so they are really spirals, but that's not germane to our discussion. We'll just say we're studying the cycles. We studied the cycle of introversion and extroversion, which we experience many times per day. And we are now currently studying the cycle that is called the human life cycle. Some call it the cycle of rebirth. We began somewhere in the middle of our human life when we began to look back on what we had done. And from there we followed the spirit through the death experience, and we focused primarily on the extraction of experience of the lifetime just finished, so that nothing would be lost, because our time here is very valuable, and it's extremely important that nothing be lost. we followed how that material was impressed from the ethers into the region of impressionability of our desire body, which some call the astral body. Then we spent a lot of time discussing the processing of the life just passed in the desire world. And we did that talking about the various states called purgatory and first heaven. And then after that, we studied the extraction of experience from the concrete mind and our sojourn in the concrete subdivision of the world of thought. And that subdivision is called second heaven in the post-mortem part of the cycle. One of the things we noted along the way is that in second heaven, we functioned as creative nature spirits. And those who had developed the capacity in the concrete mind to think and to think creatively probably participate much more than others, who are basically used as instruments. In all of this, we have noted that there are central thoughts, but they're not like regular thoughts. They are divinely conceived thoughts, and they relate to the essence of experience. And how to say it? Ooh. These thoughts are sometimes called atoms, seed atoms. And when we use the word atom, we don't mean atom like an atom of boron or dysprosium or sulfur or something like that. We're talking about an atom meaning the smallest bit possible. And the smallest bit possible in this case is a focus in human spirit. All of our vehicles are dense physical, the interpenetrating etheric vital body, the auric desire body, and the mind all have their origin in thought. Thoughts projected from the spirit. But these thoughts are special because every bit of experience that we've ever had of these primal thoughts is recorded in them. You might say they're the stem cells of thoughts. So everything that we've done when we were mineral-like, when we were plant-like, when we were human-like, animal-like, everything that we had an experience of form of, the essence of that is impressed in this thought. We have a similar thing for every experience we've had of vitality, of living and growing. And likewise, we have the same thing with our emotional nature and with our desire nature. So everything we've ever done, if we could be in touch with it, is available to us. Everything. And that's something that leaves you kind of breathless. After we had processed the material in the second heaven, which is the concrete world of thought, everything but the seed atoms was removed from concrete existence. It had been boiled down to those basic thoughts, and the essences of all the experience and all of the different vehicles of consciousness that we have was taken into the spirit as soul material. Different kind of soul for physical experience, different kind of soul for emotional experience, but all of it is taken into the consciousness of the spirit. There, it functions something like a food, like a soul food. And as a consequence of it, when the essence of experience is absorbed into the spirit, it gets assimilated to the primary divine principles from which it issued in the first place. And when that takes place, those spiritual principles are further empowered. And the general result of what we have been able to get out, as far as we are developed now, out of all of our past experiences is called soul power. And soul power is what is necessary for creation. It is necessary for sustained being. It's necessary for magic and healing and things of that nature. I'm way away from the notes by now. So these things are left right at the point, so to speak, where the spirit in the transcendental realms focuses into the concrete realms. It's sort of like leaving your shoes at the doorstep or at the threshold of the spirit, accessible to the spirit. Some even claim that the focus of the spirit is right at that point, that the self itself has a very tiny focus, and it's right in that point between the abstract and concrete mind. After that, we are in what is called third heaven. And in third heaven, the spirit, the self, the spiritual ego, the soul, whatever name you want to call it, is at one with itself. It is contemplating its own divinity in itself. And that is what is called self-realization in third heaven. Obviously, being in purely spiritual realms after having been focused so long in the various degrees of limitation in the concrete worlds, it is inspired. And this is something like, for an analogy in the material world, this is something like being at the very peak of a mountain. Because only at the peak of the mountain can you see everything in all directions. And this is the peak of our current life cycle. This is as high as we can go. And this state is singular, because you are one and one alone with yourself. Okay, that's our review. And the review isn't like the original, but that's the way things go. Now, in the two talks previous to this talk, we have been trying to perform the impossible task of describing the self. Now, those talks are available if you're interested in them as talks number 103 and number 104. So each of those talks, which was a different way of looking at transcendental experience, trying to get you to sort of get to the point and fly off on yourself, each of them was only partial. And as a consequence, they could only be partially successful. And because of my imperfections, that portion is probably pretty small. All I could do was point, and it's up to the individual to do what they can. It is as well as I can do at this time in my development. Now, the spirit is, as we understand it from here, is universal. So when we're dealing with transcendental things, we're dealing with things that from here appear to have many, many sides to things. Now, there are other ways that we have looked at the self. In the series on cosmography, we've looked at the self in several other ways. But I don't remember the numbers of those talks, and I'm probably not going to index these thoughts until I'm too old and feeble to talk anymore. That's what old people do. This evening, we're going to try to look at another way of getting to an understanding of the self. We're not going to be totally successful, but that can only happen with a baptism by the Holy Spirit, by an initiation to awareness into transcendental being. So what we're going to do is something partial again. And this time, we're not going to be so much focusing on the personal experience as much as we can derive of it, of the experience of the self. I haven't given up on doing that. It's just that I thought another way of looking at things would probably be better. And tonight we're going to do that, and the next time we're going to do it again in yet another way, but it'll be very brief next time, and it will lead us into the second half of the cycle that we're talking about. Now, what we're going to try to do this time is much more graphic, and it's very down to earth. And because of that, I have to issue a warning. We have to always keep in our mind that we're dealing with a metaphor or an analogy image, and that's all we are dealing with. But the problem is, because we are so materialistic, we tend to take the reflective image as the reality. And that is dangerous, because then we become, how would you say it, spiritual materialists. Now, it's valuable to do these kinds of things because you do get insights, at least I do, but you always have to be able to drop the image once you get the insight, and then you can live more in the spirit. Now, sometimes people take these things literally, and in history, that has been the case. There was a time in Greece where some of the sophists took one of the images that we're going to use this evening. They took it literally, so that Aristophanes, the great comedic playwright of ancient Greece, actually wrote a play making fun of them. So, all right, that's an introduction to what we're going to do, which is another example of Richard Koepsel making a fool of himself by trying to do something impossible. If one takes a physical object and rotates it as if it is on an axis, there will be a torque force at right angles to the rotation. And that torque will be very minuscule. It depends on the mass of the object that's being rotated, and it depends on the strength of the force that is doing the rotation. Now, if the object is a massive object, like the Earth, the rotation is very much stronger than if we just take a simple thing and do it. Now, with regard to the Earth, there are several kinds of torque. Like, for example, the Earth is rotating on its axis, and that produces a pretty strong torque force. And that torque force, in effect, works like a gyroscope in a ship. It stabilizes and it holds the Earth in a reasonably stable place. But there's another kind of rotation of the Earth that is much, much tinier. Each month, as the moon approaches the plane of the equator, because the equator bulges, and the bulge is due to that axial rotation of the Earth, the bulge, it's not a perfect sphere. If it were a perfect sphere, the gravitational pull from the moon would be the same. But because there is the equatorial bulge, the moon is attracted more to that than to any other spot on the Earth. And as a result, as it approaches the equatorial belt, it causes the Earth to tilt just a tiny little bit. And then when it passes on after the equator, it pulls it back to its place where it was before. But the effect of the original tilt is felt. And as a consequence, from that first little tilt, there is a torque vector that goes out at right angles to the moon's orbit at that time. And when it comes to be 2 weeks later, roughly speaking, and the moon comes back again going the other direction, there's another little tilt. Now, the equilibrium has been restored, but there is still effect. And there is a minuscule torque that is produced by the tilt. But because the Earth is floating in space, that minuscule torque that is developed by the temporary tilting or rotation is affected. And that means when it gets pulled at right angles to the moon's orbit, there's this tiny fraction of a wobble. But it gets repeated again and again and again, month after month after month. And eventually it produces an entire wobble of the Earth. And the wobble of the Earth takes approximately 25,868 years, roughly. Different astronomers have different views about it. And the phenomenon of that is what is called the precession of the equinoxes, which is understood and measured very carefully. It has effects astronomically and astrologically. So we can see the torque mechanism that we're talking about. Now, if we go to the ethers, we find something similar. We find something similar in what is called electromagnetism by scientists. So that if we take an iron rod or an iron bar and we wrap all kinds of wire around it and then run a current through the wire, the bar becomes a magnet. And how strong the magnet is depends on how strong the current is and how strong or how many turns there are in the wrapping around the bar. When this happens, what in effect is happening is that the coil around the iron bar is in effect a field, an electric field that stimulates magnetism, and there is at right angles, just as it was with the wobble of the Earth with a mechanical torque, there is at right angles a vector of electromagnetic energy, or magnetism in this case. And you can carry this to a great extent. Even that wire that's being wrapped around the bar has a field around itself, so that there's a cumulative field of many tiny fields at right angles to the main. But that's carrying things pretty far. Now, in the ethers, this phenomenon is bidirectional. If we pass a current down a bar, it will produce an electric field around it. In fact, if that bar is magnetic to begin with, that is how dynamos work. That's how from magnetism we get electricity. Now, we can't see that field, but it is wrapped around the magnet just almost like the coil is wrapped around the magnet. You put iron filings there, you can see roughly how the field looks. So what we're trying to get at here is that if there is a magnetic or if there is an electric impulse at right angles, a field forms around it. That's the idea we're trying to get at. Now, this isn't offered to be a physics talk or anything like that, or it isn't offered to verify the concepts of mysticism by material science. This is only offered to provide an example of a principle. An example of a principle as it works in the chemicals and as it works in the ethers. Now what we want to do is we want to abstract the idea. Without electricity, without gravitation, we want to abstract that idea. Suppose we imagine a ray issuing from some invisible point, some emanation from an invisible source. If we do that, we can imagine a field forming around that ray. Now, that's something we can all imagine in our mind fairly easily. The next step is a little bit more difficult. Imagine an infinite or near infinite number of rays coming from that same point. And each of them has a field that forms around it. Obviously, those interpenetrating fields, it's going to make a pretty lively place. It's going to be a place that is excitingly lively. Now, if we carry it further and say that there is not just one point, but there is an indefinite number of points that are, so to speak, contiguous with each other, doing the same thing, the liveliness of that field is almost beyond imaginative conception. That's the beginning of the analogy that or the analogical image we're trying to produce. In the image, the ray that comes from an invisible source, and maybe the ray itself is invisible, represents divine spirit. The coiling fields and interpenetrating coiling fields represent life spirit. Now, because we're so materialistically, we can only realize this like as a sphere being like this, rather than just being, without being beholden to any kind of shape. This is a materialistic analogy of what life spirit is like. Now, one mystic who has had waking consciousness in life spirit describes it. He doesn't describe it with coils and rays and things like that. He describes it as a place bristling with life, which is about as good a description as I've seen anywhere. Now, this image can be enhanced a little bit, and we can do that without stretching it too far and distorting it. For example, we could say that the coils, that the fields of light are illuminated from within. They're lit. so that even though the source is invisible, like the source that is a battery is invisible, the emanation becomes light. However, the light that we see in life spirit is not like the light we see here with our eyes. If it were, and we were to peer on it, it would be blinding. Instead, it is the light that is seen by the inner eye, by the self. Some people like to call that the mind's eye, but it's the light that you see when you understand the truth of something. You intuitively know that something is self-evidently true. This kind of light is healing. And it is as healing and as fortifying as it is bright. So as long as you could peer into it, it would be strengthening to you. In fact, some people think that's what mysticism is to constantly have, no matter whatever else is doing in down below, is to constantly have the mind's eye focused on that light. Now, we could add to this and say that the light is not cold light, like the light that comes out of these LEDs. It is feelingful light. And the feeling is a feeling of universal love. And trying to hold that all in consciousness in our mind, it's too much for us. It's something, the true experience of it has never ever been said to be anything but ineffable. Some would even say that what we're trying to do with an image like this is sacrilegious. Hopefully it can help, but it can give us an idea that we can point somewhere. Now, these fields not only interact with the adjacent fields, but in the whole, without having any boundaries on it, within it there are sweeps and there are eddies throughout the whole. And this brings us to where we want to reach. But before we get there, we want to take a little tiny side trip. Now, this image that we have, if we take that and make it material, it's a pretty good description of the sun. And the sun is considered the lower octave of the invisible sun of life spirit. So this is true. But so in this analogy, that the light that we see is not blinding, but the light that we see is healing. And with the physical sun, the heat would be destructive. But that heat, if we see in the spiritual sun that we're trying to represent, that heat would represent love. It would represent the sacrificial love that is productive of the entire cosmos. Again, we have to say, please remember that this is only a limited material image. And we're only using it to get at something that may be impossible to reach by any intellectual means. Now, a lot of people could make objections about this, and a lot of people could say that this is too limited and could describe all sorts of other limitations. And I realize that that's true. But just remember, it's just a little baby step. We're trying to get at something that is extremely hard to get at. Now, if we have a vessel of water, say like a bathtub or something like that, and we take and we run our hand through it, we produce eddies in the water. And the eddies if we consider them inwardly, they're really interesting. They are things, but they have no composition other than the medium that they're in. And actually, what they are is they're defined by the absence of the medium. They are nothings. Now, if we try to apply this to our analogical image that we're trying to create here, we have to modify our thinking a little bit. Life spirit is continuous. Some people like to say that this is the densest of all worlds. No way. This world is actually quite porous. The spaces between the particles in the atoms are quite wide. But life spirit is continuous. It's so continuous that some Greek mystery schools called it the crystallium, because it was like a light that there was within it no break. In a crystal, the atoms are packed so closely together that you can't pack them any closer. However, a crystal is hard. And so the crystal doesn't help us where we're trying to get, because the life spirit is subtle. It's subtle beyond even the comprehension we get in an idea. Now, when we try to comprehend this, it's too hard to grasp because we're so used to time and space, and as we know them to be, that we just can't understand it. There is only life and light and love and the truth of their being in life spirit. It is self-evident. Now, life spirit, as we have seen in previous talks, is always paradoxical, because the mind can only think in differences, and when there is such total unity, it is filled with paradox. The Buddhists, especially a lot of the Zen Buddhists, talk a lot about the not being of life spirit, but they use different words altogether. So we're talking about a medium with density approaching the infinite, while at the same time it is subtle beyond our current comprehension. Now, the sweeps and the currents in the fields, that very lively general field, are currents of consciousness. It is contemplating itself. It could be, in some ways, likened to an ocean with tides and currents, but an ocean which has no surface and which has no shore. That has been done also by mystics in the past. Some would relate to the sweeps or to the currents as perpetual waves of love. Love more and more giving to the selfness that is life spirit. Now, these sweeps and currents are sufficient to produce eddies or vortices. And those vortices are selves. We've gotten just about to where we want to get to. Now, this idea of a self as the spiritual or a spiritual ego is very, very old. If we look in the Exodus of the Bible, Jehovah, who is the macrocosmic self, who is a big whirlpool in the life spirit, is seen in the Exodus as either a whirlpool of smoke by day or a whirlpool of fire by night. Some translations use a different word, but for some of the other expressions of it, the Lord spoke to Job out of a whirlwind. Or Elijah was taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. They make it sound like an action. What it is a realization of what was there all along. It was that shape of God, if you want to use the word God, that the sophists grabbed onto and claimed that everything was a vertex, which in a way, a very vague way, is true. And it is that Aristophanes made his joke or made fools of them for talking that way. Now, the peculiarities of the vortices in the image that we are trying to develop have been the source of much mystical philosophizing. Some mystical schools doubt the value of the self. They're much more interested in the selfness, which is the medium, which is the ocean, which is that, how do you say it, bristling life. The self has no substance apart from the substance of the selfness. And so some schools then teach that the self is an empty illusion. It's not like the autonomous existence that we have in our physical bodies. Our physical bodies are part of the physical earth, but we have separated ourselves from it. But you can't separate the vortex from the medium in which it is. And this is why it is considered illusion by a lot of schools. The vertices are discrete in a way, but not in their discretion. They are not away from the medium in which they exist. Now, if you think about this, think about an ecstatic poet. An ecstatic poet saying, I cannot exist apart from you, and singing that to the divine lover. It is that is the poetic feel of what we're trying to do with a grossly material imagination. Now, the formation of the vortices is also fascinating. Now, if we sweep the hand through the water in the bathtub, the eddies will only endure as long as the momentum can overcome the viscosity. Eventually, the viscosity eats up all the momentum and no more eddy. Now, in some ways, this physical image works for what we're trying to do, but in that way, it doesn't. Because in life spirit, there is no resistance as we know it. My yoke is easy, Christ says, speaking from life spirit. Consequently, the vertices could endure forever. So, here we have the concept of the self being immortal. That may or may not be true, but we won't go into that. It's too far afield for the simple thing we're trying to do tonight. Now, something else occurs in this figmentary analogical image we're creating. If we look at the eddies in a brook, we see something interesting. Little bits of flotsam are drawn into the vortex and they collect. And they usually collect in a ball-like shape. Now, obviously, there is no flotsam in life spirit. There's nothing there but light and life and love. Nothing beyond this. This is pure. Now at this point we have to stretch the image to the point that we're almost breaking it. But it may be helpful, so I'm willing to take a shot at it. Now, because there is no flotsam in life spirit, it doesn't mean there isn't a collection in the vortices. There is, in our image, the collection of light in the life spirit, like a little ball of light, you might say. And in this sense, the vortex acts as a lens. It focuses life spirit into vortices or into necessary nothings within life spirit in the same way that we focus sunlight using a magnifying glass. Now this focused objectification is in effect one of the primary attributes of the threefold spirit. It is something distinct. And it is, you might want to say it, it is an illusion within the illusion, because if you consider the vortex to be illusion, the lens effect of the vortex in the heart of that vortex is in another illusion. In the selflessness that is life spirit, the life spirit becomes a self. It becomes a focus of light. So, for example, we can see that the light of divinity in someone, we experience that when we have altruistic life spirit love. We see the light of divinity in someone, because we know that is not part of personality. And in all of this, even though there are these pseudo, I can't say concrete, but these pseudo-definite manifestations, in all of this, the life spirit remains virgin. It is pure in itself without it being contaminated by whatever is built in it. Now, in this whole business, the love of life spirit, the altruism, is interesting. Because if we really love someone and we really see spirit in them, we love everyone. Because seeing the love in someone else is like seeing them through a lens back into life spirit. I don't know how to say it any other way, but it's a wonderful thing. Isn't it nice? This happens to be on Valentine's. It works out very well. All right. Some people think that altruism is loving all of humanity all at the same time. That's not perfectly right. You get a sense of all of humanity through someone, but it is necessary to have the focus on every manifestation of it as the means or the pathway or the lens to understanding life spirit. Because if we think that altruism is looking at loving the whole, it's pretty hard to love the whole, very hard to love the whole without the experience, a definite experience of part of it. It's in a way like missing the trees for the forest, which is just the opposite way of looking at things. Some people miss the forest for looking at the trees, but if we try to look at the whole without being in touch with the reality of any part of it, that's missing the forest missing the trees for the forest. Christ, functioning from life spirit, needed his disciples. He needed them as much as they needed him. There is that relationship between the individual and the whole. If you got that much love, you have to have something to love. It's something as simple as that. If life spirit is anything, it is purposeful. And the creation is not some divine, idle recreation. It's purposeful. You see the people that you recognize are clearly spiritual, what they do is purposeful. Even seemingly trivial things are purposeful. So the sooner we can attune ourselves to divine purpose, the more joyful our life will become. Now, there is in the evolutionary creation a principle that might be called the law of reciprocal service. The one behind the macrocosm gives of its being to everything in the creation. It gives everything in the creation the opportunity to participate and become in divinity. And the reciprocal of that is that as each being, human or angelic or animal or whatever, as each being comes into its divinity by creating within and creating the creation itself, it is given back to the one. So that the receiving of the one from everything within it is a unspeakable return in service. I don't know how to say it any other way. It's like, I suppose, if you have a class and everybody in the class comes to some kind of enlightenment and in their creativity feed it back to you, it's something of that order, but except on everything in the cosmos. Now, this principle applies to what we're trying to discuss. In giving birth to divine selfhood, life spirit realizes the selfhood of itself without having to be a self. So for all of the individuals that are given this unique, separate selfhood, the essence of that is reflected back into life spirit, which would otherwise be nothing but selfness and would not have that same total objectivity. So in the act of sweeping and creating vortices, in the act of the birth of the self, both the individual and the universal self are born in that same act. It's a little bit off subject, but the selfhood is also passed on to divine spirit in that very intimate relationship between the divine spirit and life spirit. In Christ, speaking through the body of Jesus, says, "To know me is to know the Father." And so when the life spirit, or Christ in the life spirit, knows its selfhood in selfness, that is reflected to the Father. Now, pondering this, if we can really ponder this, it reveals a lot of the passages of St. John's Gospel that open up and are just very, very rich. And while we're looking sidelong, let's try one little more side trip. when we began this analogical image, we spoke of an ever-invisible locus, or ever-invisible loci, located anywhere and everywhere. And from them emanated the invisible vectors of power in every direction. Now, some mystical philosophers would say that these loci were focuses of the divine spirit. And some would go even further and say that they were concentric with the focus of virgin spirit beyond divine spirit. And some would even say that at the heart of each vortex is the focus that is the center of our being. All right. Now, the principle of reciprocal service works both ways. Not only do higher states of the spirit, divine spirit or life spirit, gain an objective selfhood in the focus of primal being and in selfness, the selves gain divine creativity from above, so to speak, which brings us to one more elaboration of our image. A few minutes ago, we said that the sweeps or currents of consciousness that set the vortices in motion. We also mentioned that without resistance, they could spin on indefinitely as immortal selves. But that's not the divine intent. The divine intent is for us to be free. That if we harmonize with the universal spirit, we do so freely. Freely have ye received, now freely give. And we can only create to the degree that we are free. We can't create our version or our angle on the cosmos, our gift to the divine, unless we're free. And this means that as we come more and more deeply into self-consciousness, and we gain more and more soul power in the repetition of the life cycle, we have to take over for ourselves. We have to set ourselves spinning. And literally, to some extent, that's what happens in the deepest of spiritual exercises. We must maintain the spinning vortex from ourselves. Now, how this is done is for the moment too far afield of what we're trying to do. So this is as far as we're going to go this evening. Now, please keep in mind that what has been presented is a complex analogical image, but it's only an image. It's fraught with all kinds of limits and potential illusions, as all things in the material world are. Nonetheless, if we ponder this with spirit inwardly, it can be very, very helpful. It has proven to be very, very helpful to me for coming at inner understandings and guiding me toward the experience, which of course means dropping the image and living like a grown-up in the reality. Now, this is the third talk in trying to understand the self in third heaven. There was going to be one more. This one was a little bit awkward and a little bit abstruse, but we have to start somewhere. So next time, we'll look at this in a very different way, and we will try to move on from here and start the second half of the cycle of rebirth. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is the ray cyclic?
Excuse me?
Is the ray that you were talking about
Yes.
cyclic?
I think it's constant. I think it's constant. Because that's the difference between divine spirit and life spirit. Divine spirit is like, for an analogy, like the fixed signs in astrology. And the life spirit is more like the common signs. They orbit around that constant projection from divine spirit. That's what tradition says, and it is palatable to me intellectually. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We got it in under an hour. Last week,